long-standing joke that every year is the year of the cloud, implying that this year people will finally start adopting the cloud for all their technology needs. But change doesn't really work like that. It's incremental, it's subtle. And now the cloud is a major component of almost all enterprises. Not that long ago, Docker made a splashy debut similar to the cloud, and I would draw an analogy between the adoption of containers and the cloud. Is this the year of containers? I'm no expert, so I asked someone with a little more background on the topic to join me. Hey everyone, welcome to the Anexipod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 25, recorded January 19th, 2018. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet. Here on the Anexipod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we will be talking about Docker and the future of containers with Docker captain, Pluralsight author, and American muscle car aficionado, Nigel Poulton. Welcome to the show, Nigel.
Oh, thank you very much. What an intro, eh?
Well, I looked at your About Me page, and I was like, oh, American muscle cars, that's random. And I'm sure listeners can tell by your accent, you're not originally from the U.S.
That's right. I still live in the UK as well. So they're very much a novelty over here, which I think is part of the thing that appeals to me. But you know what? I mean, you put bios about yourself up there. And in the past, my bio has always just been technology. And it can make you look a little bit one-dimensional sometimes. So I thought, I mean, everybody says, oh, you know, I'm like a father or a mother or whatever, you know. And I just thought, what's a little bit different? And I do like loud, noisy American muscle cars. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah, my big thing is beer. So I try to include that on there too.
Cool.
All right. Well, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working with containers?
So these days I am a bit of a self-confessed containerholic. It's what I do with pretty much all of my time when I'm not, looking at American muscle cars on Instagram and what have you. But in the past, so I've worked in technology for probably going on about 20 years now, and I've done the rounds just about everything. I started out as a network guy. We moved on to Windows NT4. After that, I became a storage guy, did a bunch of Linux. And then in my last job before I did containers, I'd kind of started moving into more of a management position, which I wasn't a big fan of. I've always been a techie at heart. And I was looking after a storage team and 2 Linux teams. And at the time I was doing, I had a blog, I ran a podcast, I was traveling around the world, going to all these like different events, HP and VMware, and people would have me come over to their events and things. And I happened to be sitting at HP Discover. I think they call it HPE Discover now, but back in the day it was HP Discover. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the first DockerCon was going on. And I was sat down with Calvin Zito, actually, the guy that heads up like the blogger program for HP Storage. And I said, Calvin, I love you bringing me out to Vegas and all these places to these shows. But to be honest, right now, I just wish I was at DockerCon and not here. And he was like, gee, thanks, Nigel. And it started from about then. Like I found myself in this sort of quasi-management position where I was losing. Well, I didn't have production access, okay? It's probably a good thing. But when you stop getting production access, you start to think, am I losing that technical edge? And it was about the time that Docker was at 0.9 or 0.9, and I started playing about with it. And honestly, I had this, like, it was an epiphany. It was one of those proper aha moments. Just playing with containers and Docker at the time, for me, was akin to when I first came across the virtual machine. It's like being hit by like a bus or a freight train or something. It totally was just like, wow, I see the potential of this. Just like I had with VMware, like, I don't know, 10 years before or whatever it was. So that's kind of how I got my start in containers. And it's, I've never looked back.
Okay. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about with the VMware thing. I remember loading up, it was a 3.5 of ESX and going, oh, okay. I think I see where the next, 5 to 10 years of tech is going. I should probably get on this bandwagon.
And I think that's an important point, right? So you have these moments where you see something, you have this like moment of clarity, and then the decision comes. It's like, well, what do I do about that? Do I grab the proverbial bull by its horns and, do I ride the train, or do I wait and see how it all turns out? And because I'd only really ever had that experience once before with VMware, and it was such an important, technology, it changed my career and just about everybody else's career. When I had that same experience again, I thought, you know what, I'm getting on this train early.
That's a great idea. And it sounds like you were at a bit of a crossroads career-wise, too. And we could do like a whole show on what should I do with my tech career. Like when you come to that moment, do I step away from the keyboard and go into management, or do I go into like deep dive tech or become how would you describe what you do now?
Okay, yeah. So I suppose if I just wind the clock back a little bit to when I started with containers, right? I started playing around with them in my lab at home. It was back when I had a couple of Mac Minis in the lab and this shuttle server before everybody was fully in with the cloud for their own labs and stuff.
Right.
And I was playing around with Docker a lot, and I started doing like small consulting gigs for companies that were just starting out in the industry, doing a bit of cloud native, wanted to do a bit with containers, but didn't really know anything about it. So I did a bit of that, packed in my job in London, working for a financial services company. But then at the same time, got offered a job creating video training courses for a company called Pluralsight. Now I say got offered a job, I'm not paid on staff by Pluralsight. I submit a video training course, they put it in the library, and I get a royalty from it. But they said, hey, look, I think they liked the accent a little bit. It's a little bit unique. It helps sometimes. And they said, you come across quite well in these training videos. I'd done one for them before on storage, and they said, you know what, we'd love for you just to do a bunch of training courses. Now, at the time, I didn't really know enough about Docker to put myself out there, so I did some Linux training courses. In the background, like I said, I was picking up the odd small gig here and there, helping, startup companies figure out how to use Docker on Amazon Web Services. And then I got to a point where I thought, you know what, I actually do know Docker at least well enough to be able to start training and teaching other people. So then I started doing the Docker video training courses for Pluralsight. I've got 5 or 6 of those out there now. And I've got a Docker book as well called Docker Deep Dive, which I'm constantly updating. So in fact, I'm working on that this month, about to push a big update to it. But I'm constantly trying, these days I live my life constantly trying to keep the video courses up to date and the books up to date.
Okay.
And it's fun.
Yeah. No, it sounds like fun. I'm a fellow Pluralsight author myself, so I know that whole routine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's good stuff. When we talk about containers, a lot of time it's synonymous with Docker and Docker Inc. Can we peel back the onion a little bit and figure out where Docker lives in the larger context of containers?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that the modern container initiative that we have now, it is all thanks to Docker. There was a bit of LXC at the start as well, but Docker was the company that really pioneered it. I mean, containers as a bunch of constructs in the Linux kernel that you can build yourself and build a container out of have existed for quite a while, but it was always just like the Googles and the Facebooks and the Twitters and people that usually would have, the odd Linux kernel engineer on staff that were using containers. But it was Docker Inc. and the Docker project that brought them to the masses, that kind of made it easy for people like you and me to consume them. So we have to thank Docker for giving us modern containers, right? Those were the guys that glued everything together and gave us a nice, really simple user experience. Mm-hmm. And for the longest time after that, they were really driving all of the innovation. So the Docker API and the Docker command line and stuff just became de facto industry standards, really. A little bit less so these days, right, as the ecosystem's matured. I mean, Docker is certainly still a big player and probably always will be, or at least the name Docker will be, right?
Right.
But these days, I would say alongside the likes of, the Kubernetes project is huge. I think Red Hat are big players in there. So probably between Kubernetes, Red Hat, and Docker, you've probably got the 3 main players there.
Okay. And I know last year Docker split off. There's always been like Big D Docker, which was the company, right? And then Little D Docker, which was the open source project. And they renamed that open source project Moby, correct? That's
right, yeah. So I think what started to happen really was, so Docker started out as this lightweight tool that let us build and manage containers. But just the way that the project was moving at light speed, right, or warp speed even. And in any project that's moving so fast, I guess bad design decisions get made and you have to rush some things in. And what happened was this like small, slick, fast Docker binary, like the client and especially the daemon, started to get really bloated. And a bunch of other projects in the community, like ecosystem partners and what have you that were leveraging Docker and I don't know, like building networks using Docker and storage and orchestration systems. They were all using the Docker daemon, but as it started to get bloated, they were like, you know what? I don't know that we actually want all of this bloat that's in there. All we maybe want is like a container runtime, which if you know the VM world, right, is your container runtime would be analogous to ESXi, right? But Docker was kind of packaging in everything else with that GUI. So it would be like putting vCenter and all of VMware's orchestration pieces and bundling it with ESXi. So the container community was like, we don't really like that. So Docker started to kind of lose a bit of popularity and people were getting miffed at them or upset with them. So they decided to say, okay, fair enough, right? We'll take this big daemon that's a bit bloated and we'll start breaking out projects, to follow the Unix philosophy of saying, let's build small tools and then let's compose them into bigger applications, right? So what Docker did was it looked at the daemon and it said, let's pull the networking code out. There's libnetwork. Let's pull out the container runtime. Okay, there's containerd. So the Moby project was kind of part of that. It was like saying, okay, let's have a bit of separation between Big D, Docker, the company, like Docker Inc., and the project. Now, don't get me wrong, Docker Inc. still maintains and owns the project, really, but there's a little bit more of a separation going on there. And then they're starting to unpick a bunch of stuff out of the daemon. So Docker is going through a huge process of modularizing these days. Now, actually, I'm going to say this, right? A lot of people were kind of upset when they did this thing with Moby because Solomon Hykes, the founder of Docker, got up on stage at DockerCon and basically moved the GitHub repo live on stage in front of 5,000 or 6,000 people. And I've got people sat next to me like developers that are like, don't do it, Solomon, don't do it. It's going to break all of my builds and stuff, Yeah. And, whenever there's a big change like that, there's always a bunch of confusion within the industry. People are like, well, where do I go now? And what do I do? So Docker's had a rough ride, in my opinion, probably over about the last 18 months. It's still doing really well, don't get me wrong. It's still really popular. The product is still great. It's so simple to use it. And they're really pushing the boundaries of making our lives as infrastructure guys and as application developers much easier. But there's no plain sailing when you're like at the vanguard of some, technology movement that's changing the industry, right?
Right. And it sounds like he made sort of what I'd call like an autocratic decision. Okay, this is what we're doing, and we're doing it right now, rather than have it go through a whole bunch of committees and discussion and just kind of never making the change because it just everybody would have an opinion, and maybe that repo would never get moved to its new GitHub.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I wasn't involved in the discussions that went on behind the scenes to make the decision, but I know from the community perspective, a bunch of people were a little bit upset because a bunch of stuff is done out in the open. It's all open source, right? But when decisions like that, and some of the decisions like with regards to swarm mode and things like that, happen without the community knowing beforehand, and it just gets landed on the community, they get a little bit upset saying, well, you're open source and you're doing things in the open, but some things are not in the open. And so, bumps in the road. I feel like that's sort of the reality of being an enterprise company while still trying to embrace open source. Is you got to do a balancing act between how open am I and how closed do I need to be to actually get things done in a timely manner. Totally. Such a hard balancing act, yeah. So based on the rapid pace of innovation and churn that's happening in the container space, what do you think Docker needs to do to stay ahead of the curve and stay relevant? Well, I think priority numero uno there is to still be in business when people are listening to this podcast. Now, in no way am I suggesting they're about to go out of business, right? Right. But they're a startup. They've had several rounds of venture capital funding. They've taken, I think, somewhere in the order of about $250 million US. At some point, they need to at least have a plan to be turning a profit. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a plan, right? But look, priority number one is for Docker Inc. still to be around, okay? The next thing, I think it still really relates to that business plan. So, I don't know, right? Docker as the container runtime, like that bit that's equivalent to ESXi, right? It's very much commoditized these days. They're not going to make any money off of that, right? And I think when they realized that, they thought, well, I tell you what, the next layer up, the orchestration layer, that bit that lets us say, you know what, it's fine to run like 2 or 3 or 4 containers on your laptop. We can all do that. But if we're doing hundreds or thousands, then it becomes hard, right? So we layered this orchestration layer on top. And I think they looked at that and said, well, maybe the money's going to be made there. And that's looking like that's not necessarily going to be the case. And when I say that, right, I mean, as in selling an orchestration layer as like a SKU or something like that. Not sure that the money's going to be there. So maybe they need a bit of, and I know, look, I'm a techie, right? So it goes against my grain to say this, right? But I think maybe they need to innovate around like their business plan and how they sell support contracts and licenses and I don't know, all that kind of boring stuff, right? But that has to happen for them to still be a viable business, right? And I know that sounds boring, right? So let me just kind of give another twist on it. Kubernetes has recently emerged as probably the industry standard container orchestrator, right? So it looks, for all intents and purposes, if enterprises are going to be deploying container orchestration tools, it's probably going to be Kubernetes. So Docker needs a way to be able to package that as a product, sell it as a service with support contracts and things into enterprises, right? And it's not easy to sell into enterprises, especially as somebody that doesn't have a pre-existing relationship with them, right? I mean, Docker versus Red Hat, it's going to be a difficult sell for them. But they need to be sleeves rolled up and hands really involved in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Because I think when they go to enterprises and say, look, choose us as your trusted Kubernetes partner here, we've got all of the skills when it comes to the low-level Docker engine and stuff like that. Hey, we built it, right? But they need to be able to prove that they've got pedigree on the Kubernetes project as well. I hope that makes sense. I think they need a good story around Kubernetes, right? And they need a way to make money, and that's where they need to innovate, in my opinion.
Right. Those are all really good points. I like the analogy of the orchestration engine to vCenter, which VMware was able to sell very effectively. They made ESX free, essentially, and then made the orchestration piece the thing that you really licensed and paid for, and then there were like the additional features. But I guess Docker kind of missed the boat on that, or wasn't able to
Do you know what?
roll it out the same way.
I totally get what you're saying, right? I think the world is a different place these days, right? I think Docker originally looked at that and said, their orchestration layer Swarm, which is really good, okay, and it's really simple and it's really secure. I think they did look at that and say, we can package this, bundle it, and sell it, and this'll be our play, right? The problem was, though, Kubernetes, okay, and what you need to understand, or what your listeners need to understand about Kubernetes, if they don't already, I'm not trying to teach somebody how to suck eggs here, right? But Kubernetes is led by Google. It's open source, right? But it's a Google project at the end of the day. And Google, at no point ever will they need to make a profit off of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And how do you compete against that, right? So, Docker could invest in Swarm, which is their competitor product to Kubernetes, and they could throw engineers and cash at it for the next 3 years, while at the same time the community and Google throws resources at Kubernetes, and in 3 years' time, Swarm and Kubernetes, I mean, they're going to be pretty much on a par with each other, and Docker will have burned through probably most of their cash, and Google will be like, yeah, we don't even notice, it's a drop in the ocean, right? And it's not an enviable position to be in, right?
Yeah, so I think what you said, the sort of support and services that layer on top of working with containers makes a lot of sense. I kind of see that's more the Red Hat model of things, where you can get CentOS for free and run it, and that's great. But if you really want to get the full power of Red Hat, you need that support, licensing, and subscriptions.
Yes, and enterprises. I mean, look, I spent my entire life before I'm doing the videos and the books, right, in the enterprise, and especially in financial services. And those guys live and sleep on support contracts. As a boss with responsibility, you don't sleep on a weekend if you don't have a support contract. So, right. But Docker versus Red Hat going to try and sell something in an enterprise, it's a hard sell for them.
Yeah, Red Hat's already done the hard work of getting into enterprises in the first
Trusted
place.
partner, right?
Yeah, getting a foot in the door is challenging for most companies because most enterprises are like, this is the group of people we like to work with. We know who they are, and maybe they'll bring someone else in with them. But just beating down the door yourself is not. It's going to be tough, and that's.
And you know what? Those existing partners can be rubbish, and they can. Despise them, not want to go out for Christmas for Christmas dinner with them or anything, but they'll still go back to them because they're a big name. C-level executives at the company have heard of them and all that kind of stuff. It's so hard.
Yeah, no one ever got fired for buying whoever, right?
Oh no, yeah. But you could get fired for buying Docker or CoreOS or something that no one's heard of.
You went out on a limb and went with Docker, and one thing went wrong, and that's the end of your career at that enterprise.
Yeah.
I guess they're pretty risk averse. It's an interesting way to think about it. I've noticed that Docker has started pursuing the partner channel pretty heavily, knowing that a lot of VARs and systems integrators already have relationships, and maybe that's their best doorway into enterprises and that space.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right, so let's move away from the business back to the tech a little bit. So I know the container landscape has changed a lot, and you talked about sort of how Docker's decomposing what makes up the Docker runtime and sort of trying to split it out into these modules. So how has things changed, especially around like networking and storage?
So networking, to be fair, is quite a lot further ahead than storage. Docker already took the core networking code out of the daemon into effectively a library called libnetwork that provides like the core functionality, and then you plug drivers into that for particular types of networks like bridge networking or overlay networks and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Then a bunch of third parties can provide their own plugins, and people do that, Weave and Courier and people like that. Storage is looking like it's going down the same route. It's just 12 to 18 months behind maybe. To be honest, I think on the networking side of things, everything's pretty much baked. The core functionality is there. Even overlay networks are becoming commodity these days. So, there's not money to be made there. I think most of the innovation has probably already happened. But we're going to see a bunch of churn. No, churn's not the right term, actually. We're going to see a bunch of change come in the storage space as third-party vendors plug into Docker and Kubernetes, the container storage interface as well, more and more in the future.
Sure. What do you think are some of the main challenges that need to be solved in the storage space? Is it like distributed file systems or how the container persists its state?
I think it's down to persistence and state, really. Most application it's easier, let's say, to develop more stateless parts of applications in containers. But if you want to containerize the entire application, it's almost always that like persistent store on the back end, the database on the back end that's not quite been containerized yet and is still sitting on a VM or something like that. And probably that's been because the Docker storage model has lagged behind everything else. So they nailed compute. It's not really compute, right? But they nailed the runtime first, right, which you'd expect, okay, as VMware did. Then they looked at networking, and Docker acquired a company called SocketPlane, came in, gutted all the networking stuff, pulled it out of the main daemon, put it in this external library, gave overlay network, and made it super simple. A single flag on the command line to encrypt the data plane and the control plane. All couldn't be easier, right? Great job done on the networking. Work still needs to be done on the storage and volume side of things, so that persistent data side. And I don't think until that's fully baked, really, we're going to see that kind of persistent data being stored in containerized applications, right? Because the thing is, right, it's not only that it's not as mature as the networking and the rest of the stuff, it's the fact that what you do today might be changed in the future. So there's not that confidence there yet. So I think, you look at containerized applications, the biggest bit that's missing right now is that persistent storage backend, and it's because the Docker story, when it comes to storage, is just playing catch up.
Right. Yeah, when I look at design patterns for containerized applications, a lot of time the web front end or the application or these microservices that are doing things, those all fit in containers really nicely. But when you get to the database and the long-term storage backend stuff, that's almost always some sort of traditional service or platform as a service on the cloud side.
Yeah, we've done what we always do, right? We pick the low-hanging fruit first. Right. And then when things start, then the rest of the fruit is a bit harder to reach. And it's like, actually, I'm going to have to do a bit of work to make this work. And it's not quite as simple and it's not quite as fun. I think we're all waiting. And, I can potentially see this happening. But, I think we're all waiting for Docker to make persistent storage as easy as they've made networking.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is recently there's been a lot of cloud services that have sprung up around containers. Amazon has at least 3 different flavors of ways you can spin up containers. I think Azure has like 4. What do you think what's sort of the future there and the way that's going to move forward? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I think I do. I think the future and the way forward there is Kubernetes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Azure and AWS, and they're not the only ones that have this, right? But they will have a container orchestration service, for want of a better term, okay, with a K in it, and that's the Kubernetes version. And the one with a C in it is either Docker or their own, proprietary one, right? So we had ECS from Amazon Web Services, their EC2 container service. That was, proprietary stuff on the back end as far as I understand. Now they have EKS, which is EC2 Kubernetes container service, right? I think the investment and the development from AWS and from Azure and people like that going forward is almost certainly going to be on the K-based stuff, so the stuff that's using Kubernetes behind. So my advice would be, if you're looking at all these acronyms from your cloud provider, mm-hmm. and one of them has Kubernetes in the title, it's more than likely that one is going to have the brighter future.
Okay. Interesting.
I mean, look, these guys have done a good job of simplifying all of that kind of stuff, right? But they didn't know who the winners and losers were going to be. And I'm not saying anybody's going to be a loser here, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, for all intents and purposes, Kubernetes is, it's pulling away from the pack a little bit right now.
Right.
So if you're not sure which one to go with from your particular cloud provider, I would hedge your bet on the Kubernetes-based one. Okay.
And what about like on-premises? What's sort of the pattern you're seeing there? Are people deploying it on VMware or bare metal? And is there a company that's kind of come up with a great solution for Docker and maybe Kubernetes on-premises?
I haven't seen anybody that's pulling ahead in the way that we said, all of the cloud-based Kubernetes services were pulling ahead from the rest. There's decent solutions and things out there. I'm seeing people doing mainly on VMs, okay, when they're doing mm-hmm. it on premises. A lot of people were using, a lot of people in terms of the fact that, this is not like VMware or anything yet, okay? Right. But of the people that were deploying containerized services, quite a few of them were using Docker Swarm, right? And they really liked it because it was so simple to deploy and to manage, and it did all of the certificates for you. It rotates certificates. By default, it would encrypt the cluster store. You'd have a distributed encrypted cluster store. All the networking could be encrypted easy. It was really a very good, in my opinion, enterprise-grade orchestration solution, if you will. Mm-hmm. Whereas Kubernetes, on the other hand, it could kind of do all of that stuff, but it was really hard to do. You'd have to. It wasn't as hard as OpenStack. Don't get me wrong, right? But you'd have to have pretty clever people on staff that would be able to install it and manage it, and then keeping it up to date was really hard. But what we are starting to see now is that Kubernetes is starting to get a bit easier. And that comes with maturity, right?
Right.
So installing a Kubernetes cluster on premises is getting easier. Upgrading it is getting easier. at the same time, it's growing in functionality. So role-based access controls all there now. Bunch of the workloads, APIs and things have gone into GA. So I think Docker Swarm was a bit of a leader there for the on-premises stuff because it was simple and secure. And Kubernetes was like, ooh, I'm not sure I've got the appetite to take that on.
Right.
But that's getting easier now. And like we said before, right, Kubernetes has got a bunch of momentum because nobody really, well, the owner of it doesn't need to make money from it. So they can be as open as they want with the ecosystem. You know, they don't have to think, oh, well, if we do this, it might give our partners in the ecosystem an advantage. They're not bothered. So
right. It's I guess an enviable position to be in. I think what
it is, yeah.
Google's
I wouldn't want to be fighting against Google.
Yeah, 90% of their revenue is from ads. So as long as it doesn't get in the way of the ads, I suppose it's fine.
Me, it won't. Yeah.
I know one of the things about Kubernetes and I guess orchestration engines in general is that they're able to take advantage of different container runtimes, or I should say different container formats. So I know there's Docker out there, but there's other alternatives like, was it Cryo and Rocket are two of them? What are some of the differences between those and Docker?
Yeah, so I think what really happened was Docker had this daemon that we said in the, 20 minutes ago, whatever, that it got a bit bloated and the industry fell out of love with it for a while, okay? So when all that was going on, a company called CoreOS came along and said, you know what, we're going to build our own container runtime and we're going to publish the standards and stuff like that. And that's where Rocket, RKT, came from. So we kind of had this sort of... do we go with the Docker runtime and the Docker image format and all that kind of stuff, or do we go with Rocket, which is lightweight and the AppC standard that they publish? And it was like, ooh, I'm not sure what to do here. And look, I mean, competition is a good thing usually, but two competing standards, usually not such a good thing, right? It just, it sows like uneasiness in the community and people think, well, until I see a clear leader, I'm not going to buy, right? So everybody kind of came together and formed the Open Container Initiative, the OCI, and they said, look, we don't need this. Let's just collaborate and put some standards out, right? So we've got a bunch of standards out there now, right? And Docker complies with them and a bunch of other container runtimes and things comply with them. But again, it seems to hinge back to Kubernetes, right? So Kubernetes is like, think of it as like the container orchestrator, maybe vCentral or whatever, okay? And then within that, the container runtime can be Docker, or it can be Containerd, or it can be Rocket, or it can be Cryo, right? Now, for me as a customer, I probably shouldn't really be bothered. This is kind of like low-level technical stuff that, don't get me wrong, right? I love to know it and understand it.
Right.
But as a buying customer, do I really need to know what's going on down at that kind of low-level plumbing? Actually, I don't. So long as the Kubernetes API and that experience that I have is not impacted, right? So what we have is we have Kubernetes with its, plethora of published APIs, right? But then really down low in the weeds, we've got a bunch of competing container runtimes. Now, Cryo looked like it was probably going to be the most popular going forward. I mean, so right now, Kubernetes, the default runtime that it ships with is Docker. But Docker pulled all of its runtime code out of the daemon a while ago and put it into a project called Containerd, which is a Cloud Native Computing Foundation project these days. And Containerd is, for all intents and purposes, looking like that will now be probably the most popular Kubernetes runtime going forward, which is cool, right? Like for you and me and a bunch of listeners to know. But at the end of the day, does it impact anybody's experience with Kubernetes? If it does, it's very subtle.
Right. Okay. People always think about Linux when they're looking at containers. Windows actually has containers too, which sounds bizarre saying out loud. So have you seen any actual interest in using Windows containers? And what do you think the long-term prospects are of a Windows container?
Yeah, so I think the long-term view for Windows containers looks great, okay? And I'm going to throw some props to Microsoft here, right? They have played so well in the open source community when it comes to containers. I mean, there'll have been internal struggles going on at Microsoft, and I've talked to a bunch of like kernel engineers and people at Microsoft in the past that have been involved in the project. and or the projects that they're involved in open source, like the stuff with Docker and with Kubernetes, and they have tried so hard to play according to open source principles and things. They've done a great job, right? And you know what? A lot of the places that I speak at, the people that come and talk to me after I've done a presentation, are the Windows guys, because they're still trying to get their heads around, like, well, what are the advantages of containers and things? I think they're playing catch up a little bit compared to the Linux guys, because I could get shot here, right? But Linux guys seem to be maybe a little bit more forward thinking when it comes to things in the cloud. Okay.
Right.
But now the Windows guys are coming along and they're like, well, yeah, we know all about containers, and for some reason Microsoft's all over it, so maybe I should be trying to work out what our story is here at my company, whatever it is, yeah? So a bunch of people are coming to me and saying, how can we leverage containers with our Windows apps? And then, you can see them have those aha moments and be like, oh man, that could make my life so much simpler. Now, containers in Azure have been really, really successful as well for Microsoft. So, there's a great future there. On the Kubernetes side of things, Windows support for Kubernetes went into beta. I'm fairly certain in the Kubernetes 1.9 release just back in December. So that is like marching on at a great speed. And I think this is all great, right? Having a great Microsoft in the industry and having them play with Docker and with Kubernetes, and there to be feature parity whether you want to deploy something on Windows containers or Linux containers. I'm all for that. I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody, running it in production yet, but there definitely seems to be a lot of interest at some of the user groups I go to. Like, okay, I'm like, as a Microsoft person, I am now interested, and I think the latest version of Windows 10 can run the Docker for Windows can run either Linux or Windows VMs pretty seamlessly. So you can really mess around with both on a Windows machine and get a real feel for how both containers work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But like we say, you're right. It's not as, within organizations and stuff, it's not as far ahead. And when it comes to like, okay, have we got a bunch of guys that are just working on a side project here and it's like, a couple of months away from production, or, we've got some stuff in production. The Windows stuff is behind there, but I do see a lot of interest in it.
In the context of enterprises, we've kind of been talking about that. So enterprises tend to be a little slower on the side of adopting new things. It's usually like the startups or a center of or a center of excellence inside an org that adopts these really cool technologies first. But it sounds like the container space is actually maturing and getting to that tipping point. So do you think that 2018 is the year that we'll see more widespread adoption of containers in the enterprise?
It's a tricky one, right? I almost want to say yes, but I think 2019 will be quite a lot bigger. If I was to say the tipping point, I think maybe it'll be 2018. Now, obviously, I don't know, but right. I'm not convinced on that yet. And part of that reason is, I think according to IDC or Gartner recently, 80% of enterprise apps are Microsoft based. And if the Microsoft guys are still playing catch up, right, I'm not sure that we've even hit tipping point on Linux apps yet. So I don't know. It would seem a bit funny for me to say, oh yeah, well, I think it's gonna tear through the enterprise this year. It'll be the year of the container and the year of Kubernetes and all that stuff. After having just said, well, most enterprise apps are on Windows and Windows is playing catch up. So right. I don't know. I do think it will be a bigger year for containers, and I think especially Kubernetes. I'm hearing people talk about Kubernetes as the Linux of the cloud. I appreciate cloud isn't, necessarily enterprise, right?
Right.
So I think 2018 will be a bigger year for Kubernetes. I would look potentially, though, to 2019 where we might start to see a tipping point and real adoption rates.
Right. I think one of the advantages that I see to Kubernetes is the fact that it can run in the cloud or it could run in your on-premises data center. And once you have the containers and I guess whatever the deployment object is for Kubernetes, once you have that figured out, you can deploy that application wherever you want. So it's almost this overlay across that spans multiple clouds, whether it's private or public.
Potentially, absolutely, yeah.
Right.
And just let me touch on that, right? So you're saying, what's the deployment object for Kubernetes? So just in case people are curious, right, you can still develop your applications as a Docker container and then deploy it on Kubernetes, right? Whether that's on premises or Azure Kubernetes Container Service or whatever, you can take that Docker container as an image and deploy it on Kubernetes wherever. Now, Kubernetes does have a higher level construct called a pod that it actually uses to deploy things, but within that pod are containers, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
And then there's an even higher level construct that I guess some other third parties have been developing. It was Helm has one that's about like, okay, I've got these multiple different pods that might be different applications. How do you sew that whole thing together and lay it down?
Right, and that's all about patching and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, not patching, packaging.
Packaging. Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds like that could be a whole other show. Just
Oh yeah. Honestly, I mean, there's so much going on, and it's developing at such a rapid clip. It can be off-putting for some people, and it's daunting for most of us, right? But you know what I say to people when they say things like that to me, and this is going to sound corny, but it's like, welcome to the new normal.
Yeah.
If we think that, look, I write books, okay, and the books I'm writing at the moment, one is on Docker and one is on Kubernetes. I know, and it hurts me in a way, right? I know that book is of zero value if it is even close to 1 year old. Gone are the days when a book that's 5 years old is of any use to you. And do you think that hurts for me to say, right? Because books are hard to keep up to date. I have to keep that book or both of those books at least within 3 months do an update. Otherwise, I feel like I'm a fraud selling something to somebody that's already out of date. So if you thought you were going to go into an IT career or a job and containers was part of it and you were going to learn it once and then be set for 20 years, this is the new normal stuff, developing and iterating at warp speed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have your Docker deep dive book on LeanPub, and I went with LeanPub because I knew I'd get updates every 3 months or so to try to keep up with the technology. And then I have to reread, at least portions of the book to be like, okay, what's new? What's different?
Yeah, I'm about to publish an extra 200 pages to it on the 1st of February to fit in with the Docker Certified Associate exam. But that's been hard work doing. And you know what? I'll publish that in February, and I'll be so pleased with myself. And I'll take a day off to watch the new Star Trek episodes that are on Netflix that I'm missing out on at the moment. But then it'll be back to the grind,
right?
Because it never stops.
Yeah. Oh, that's crazy.
It's fun though.
Yes, it's an exciting time to be in technology. Absolutely. So my last question, as we start to wrap up, what is your favorite 80s movie?
I've got so many. I was going to say Back to the Future, right? But let me say Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Okay. I mean, both great choices. You can't go wrong with either of those.
Yeah.
I think.
What's yours?
I'm a really big fan of Back to the Future. So I could definitely be swayed that way, but I also love Goonies. So it's so hard to choose.
That is my wife's not just 80s favorite movie of all time.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nigel, thank you so much for being on the show. If people want to know more about you or what you're up to, where can they find you? Where can they find all of your things? Yeah,
so I'm out and about on Twitter all of the time, where I only ever talk technology, by the way. My Twitter handle is at Nigel Poulton. My website is nigelpoulton.com. And you can find me on Amazon, the Kubernetes book, or Docker Deep Dive. And if you search my name on Pluralsight for my videos, and that's pretty much me.
All right. Yeah, I definitely recommend both the book and the Pluralsight videos. I've watched some of them. They're very informative.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Nigel. We'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
All right.
All right. Thanks. And that was our show with Nigel Poulton. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Anexinet for helping produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital transformation, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how they can help. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anexipod, why not leave a nice review on iTunes? If you're looking for more content, you can check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-host Chris Hayner to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can find out more about me and what I'm up to on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you can miss it.